We asked Grok what the latest AI translation work on Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform texts has actually found, expecting either a dismissive non-answer or, given how this topic tends to get covered online, something wildly overstated about hidden prophecies buried in 5,000-year-old clay. What we got instead was a grounded rundown of a genuinely exciting but much less dramatic reality. A slow-building, multi-year effort by real research teams to solve one of archaeology's biggest and most boring-sounding problems, an enormous backlog of ancient texts that nobody has had time to read. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the actual scale of the problem historians of ancient Mesopotamia are dealing with. Cuneiform is the oldest known writing system in the world, developed roughly 5,000 years ago in the region that's now Iraq, originally used to write Sumerian, and later adapted to write Akkadian, an early Semitic language ancestor to modern Arabic and Hebrew, along with several other regional languages over the following 3,000 years. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets using a reed stylus, and remarkably, huge numbers of these tablets survived, baked hard by fires, buried in the collapsed ruins of ancient cities, or simply preserved in the region's dry climate. Museums and archaeological collections around the world currently hold hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets. The problem is that reading them fluently requires years of specialized graduate-level training in Assyriology, and there are only a few hundred. People on Earth qualified to do that work at a professional level. The result is a massive, well-documented backlog, tablets that have been excavated, cataloged, and photographed, sitting in museum storage for decades, simply waiting for a trained human being to have the time to sit down and translate them. The first genuinely significant AI breakthrough on this specific problem came from a team of researchers at Tel Aviv University and Ariel University, whose work was published in the journal PNAS Nexus. Their system was trained specifically on already known translations of Akkadian text, learning the patterns and structure connecting the ancient language to English, and it was capable of translating digitized cuneiform directly into readable English, without needing a human expert to manually transliterate the source text first. And one of the researchers involved, Luis Sayans of Ariel University, was careful to frame the tool's actual purpose accurately, explaining that the goal was never to replace trained human Assyriologists, but to accelerate the process of working through the enormous backlog of fragmentary Sumerian and Akkadian texts still waiting to be read, with the eventual goal of making these tools usable not just by specialists, but by non-expert researchers and students as well. He also noted, honestly, that improving the system further would require more digitized training data pulled from published scholarly papers, a genuinely unglamorous but necessary next step that doesn't make for a dramatic headline. Since that initial breakthrough, the actual research in this space has continued building steadily in the kind of incremental technical steps that real scientific progress usually looks like. In 2024, a separate research effort produced something called SumTablets, a large structured dataset specifically built to support Sumerian language processing, pairing the actual Unicode cuneiform signs from over 91,000 real Sumerian tablets with their scholarly transliterations, essentially building the training foundation that future AI translation tools for Sumerian specifically, a harder language to work with than Akkadian because it isn't related to any other known language family, would need in order to function. In 2025, a research benchmark called EvaCun tested how well existing AI language models could handle specific, more narrowly defined tasks relevant to real Assyriology work, including identifying the correct dictionary form of a cuneiform word and predicting missing or damaged portions of a text based on surrounding context, tasks that are far less dramatic than a full translation, but that directly address a huge amount of the tedious, repetitive work scholars currently have to do by hand when reconstructing fragmentary or physically damaged tablets. Most recently, in July of 2026, a project called TabletCraft introduced a bidirectional translation model trained on a dataset of 116,000 paired Akkadian English examples, expanding on earlier one-directional systems by also being able to take English text and render an attempted Akkadian cuneiform translation of it. A genuinely useful research and teaching tool, though still very much a work in progress rather than a finished, publication-ready translation instrument. Here's the honest, slightly less thrilling truth about what these tools have actually been translating. And it's worth saying directly, because it's the exact opposite of the eerily prophetic warnings framing that circulates in the more sensationalized coverage of this research. The overwhelming majority of surviving cuneiform tablets are not lost mystical prophecies or hidden creation myths waiting to shock the modern world. They are administrative records, shipping manifests, tax receipts, legal contracts, marriage agreements, court case records, inventories of grain, livestock, and textiles. This is, in fact, exactly what makes them so historically valuable to actual historians, not because they contain secret warnings, but because they provide an almost unbelievably detailed day-to-day window into how an ordinary Mesopotamian household, temple, or royal administration actually functioned nearly 5,000 years ago. The kind of granular economic and social detail that almost no other ancient civilization left behind in this volume. A tax record from ancient Uruk isn't a prophecy. It's a genuinely precious historical document precisely because it's mundane, telling historians things our royal inscription boasting about a king's military victories never would, what ordinary people actually ate, traded, argued about, and owed each other. The genuinely significant literary and mythological cuneiform texts that do exist, and there are real, important ones, were mostly already known, translated, and extensively studied by human Assyriologists decades before any of this AI research began. The Epic of Gilgamesh, widely considered the oldest substantial work of narrative literature in human history, was first translated from Akkadian back in the 19th century and has been studied, retranslated, and refined by generations of scholars since, including its genuinely striking flood narrative, in which the character Utnapishtim describes surviving a great deluge by building a boat, a story that predates and appears to have influenced the biblical flood narrative, a real, well-established, and fascinating piece of comparative religious history that has absolutely nothing to do with AI, and has been part of mainstream academic scholarship for well over a century. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and the Sumerian king list, an ancient text listing legendary and historical rulers with almost comically exaggerated reign lengths for the earliest semi-mythical kings, are similarly well known, well-translated, extensively studied texts, all fully accessible in published academic translations, long before any modern AI system was ever trained on cuneiform data. What AI tools are actually doing with texts like these isn't discovering them for the first time. It's helping process the enormous remaining backlog of similar, related, administrative and literary fragments still sitting untranslated in museum storage and helping reconstruct damaged or incomplete portions of texts using pattern prediction. Genuinely useful, quietly important work that simply doesn't produce a single dramatic "the tablets have finally spoken" moment, because it isn't structured as one discovery. It's structured as thousands of small, incremental additions to a field that's been carefully, patiently building its own picture of ancient Mesopotamia for over 150 years. It's worth being fair to what these tools are actually adding of real value here, because dismissing this research entirely would be just as inaccurate as the sensationalized version. Being able to run a rough automated translation on a previously unprocessed tablet, even an imperfect one that still needs expert human review afterward, genuinely can help specialists prioritize which of the hundreds of thousands of backlogged tablets are most likely to contain something historically significant, worth a scholar's limited and valuable time, versus which are more likely to be a routine, if still historically useful, grain shipment receipt. The predictive text reconstruction. Work coming out of research, like EvaCun, is directly useful for one of Assyriology's most persistent practical headaches, physically damaged tablets with chunks broken off or worn away, where trained scholars have always had to make careful, informed guesses about missing words based on grammatical patterns and known parallel texts. Guesswork that a well-trained AI model, given enough existing data, can now help narrow down and suggest candidates for genuinely speeding up a process that used to take a specialist a very long time to work through by hand. What this research actually represents, stripped of the invented drama, is a genuinely valuable, if unglamorous, technological assist to a small, dedicated field of scholars who have spent over a century and a half slowly, carefully building humanity's understanding of the world's earliest civilizations, one tablet at a time. It's not going to produce a shocking secret about human origins, a hidden prophecy, or anything else that fits neatly into a dramatic thumbnail. What it's actually going to produce, if the current research trajectory continues, is faster, broader access to an enormous archive of very human, very ordinary ancient records, tax receipts, legal disputes, trade agreements, and household accounts, alongside the genuinely profound literary works that scholars already know and treasure, giving both specialists and eventually the general public a richer, more complete, and more accurate picture of what daily life actually looked like in the very first cities human beings ever built. That's not a shocking revelation. It's something better. A real functioning tool quietly making one of history's oldest and most human archives just a little more readable than it was before.